Are you a leader, manager, entrepreneur, business owner, or knowledge worker? Are you leading people or wondering how to be a better leader in your own life and work? If you are, then you can be experimenting better. Welcome to The Experimental Leader, a podcast that takes a look at the ways leaders are experimenting in their own work. Hosted by Melanie Parrish, we dive into real-life conversations about how people might be using a scientist's mindset and experimenting in their work. Shift your leadership into something that works better. Join us on The Experimental Leader today.
Hey there, it's great to be with you live today. I'm so excited to be here with you. I'm back in Ontario, which is always fun for me. It's so nice to be home. I've been traveling a ton. And I've been thinking about, so my son had this experience at the airport, and it's actually like a thought that just keeps staying with me. I keep thinking about it. So his name is really long because we hyphenated his name because we're bad parents. And so it never fits on the boarding pass, which is actually a problem because you go to TSA and then they throw you back. And so we keep trying experiments to try to get this right, but we never spend quite enough time to solve the problem. So we keep being in it. So he was in this crazy situation in Austin, Texas yesterday, and it made the news. It was so bad. And we were experimenting all over the place. First, the rental car return, somebody stalled right in front of the rental car return. And so I had to abandon the car. I put it in short-term parking and took them a ticket and the keys. But literally hundreds of people had to just leave their rental cars with the keys in it on the ramp to the rental car. So that was crazy. And then TSA was crazy, and the lines at all the counters were crazy. And my son kept getting sent back and forth between customer service and check-in and all of that. And they tried to send him the third time to another counter. And he just said, no, I need you to help me. And he's 16 years old and he's a tiny bit shy. And so it was a really big deal for him to say no, but you know what happened? They helped him. And I just am really curious about, as leaders, when do we need to say no? When do we just say, no, I can't do that? Or no, that's not going to work. Or I always teach my clients to say, oh, no, I wish I could help you, but I can't. And not to explain why. Because if you explain why, then someone can argue with you about why or try to talk you out of it. But if you just say, no, this is a firm boundary, then sometimes no just really works. So I want to challenge you to think about in your life and your leadership today, what do you just need to say no to without explanation? And I am totally excited about our guest today, Dr. Steve Yacovelli, also known as the Gay Leadership Dude. Excuse me. He's an expert on diversity and inclusion, change management, and leadership. And he's worked internal for folks like the Walt Disney Corporation, IBM, Tupperware, and several universities before starting his own consulting firm, TopDog Learning Group, in 2008. And they work with both Fortune 500 companies and not-for-profit organizations. And I am so excited to have Dr. Steve on my show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, Melanie.
It's super fun to have you here. And I am just so excited to talk about all things leadership and, most things queer. So anyway, it's great. It's great to be here. And I would love to think about or talk about how you see why queer leadership, why not just leadership?
Thanks for asking that question. And so when I wrote my latest book, Pride Leadership, which if you're watching, you're seeing the little thing. I don't know how newscasters do it with the green screen. I always get it confused which way to point. But as we think about, when I was thinking about writing my next book, which was the current one, Pride Leadership, I was kind of going for just the quote unquote generic leadership book. And I've been in this space for 30 years. You see leaders who are just rocking and rolling. You see leaders who are crashing and burning, and you start to watch patterns of behavior on what's working and what's not. And so, kind of tucking all this away as I knew I was going to put together some sort of book. And then I do a lot of work in social justice, equality for both the LGBTQ community and also some other underserved and underrepresented minority groups. And I started watching my peers who are doing work. And then if you remember that the Sex and the City show back in the day, you know, Carrie Bradshaw, if you're not familiar, she's a writer. She'd sit down in her little MacBook and she always started, I couldn't help but wonder, ... And so that was kind of going through my little gay boy head was, I couldn't help but wonder, is there something about the LGBTQ plus or queer experience that lends itself an opportunity to exercise what I found to be the top 6 competencies, and you're seeing them right behind me.
Can you just say those out loud? Do you mind saying those out
absolutely.
loud?
So the 6 that I really focus my energy on, and I truly think make a difference with any leader, are having authenticity, leadership courage, embracing empathy, effective communication, building relationships, and shaping culture. And so, but if I started putting those through the rainbow lens, as I like to say, and I just think that if you're a queer person, you have the opportunity to exercise and practice these a little bit differently than our straight brothers and sisters and siblings. So for example, authenticity. You know, I mean, you talk to the Brene Browns and all sorts of great folks who are saying your authentic self is a powerful leadership tool. Yes, in general, that's so true. But if I'm an out gay man at work and being my authentic self, if I'm a trans person who's truly being my authentic self in the workplace, that's exercising my authenticity, but that's power. That's leadership. And how can you leverage that to be an even more effective leader? And that's kind of how I landed on Pride Leadership.
And so the thing that pops into my head as you're talking, especially about authenticity, I get really curious, like, where does safety play into all that? How do I be, you know, queerly authentic? When do I be queerly authentic? And when do I like back off of that? Yeah. Or maybe I'm just not brave enough. I don't know. I try to be brave, but when do I pay attention to the voice in my head that says you might lose something if you're
absolutely
out?
Absolutely. And actually in my chapter on authenticity, I have that conversation about understanding context and your authenticity. So I always equate it to, you know, the dials on a radio or whatever, you know, type of device doesn't date me. And so I think about, you know, how Steve is when I'm with my best friends and we're at a pub or a bar, when we can do such things, if you're comfortable now, or when I'm with my great Aunt Mildred. You know, it's still Steve, but my context is a little bit different. And so I'm dialed a little bit adjusted here and there. Pre-COVID, I used to do a lot of work in Europe. And I know, having been there, having lived there, that the very gregarious, very smiley, a very extroverted Steve needs to dial it down a little bit when I'm sitting in front of a European classroom. Now, it doesn't mean I'm fake Steve, no. It just means that I understand the context, and that could be around safety, that could be around fit, that could be around building trust. And then, you know, usually it's multi-day workshops. By the end of day one, and I've amped it up back to my really normal Steve because I've built rapport and trust with those around me.
That's interesting. We always like to play the game gay or French when we're there.
We say Nelly or foreign, yeah. That
was because especially the scarves, like it's like, is that guy gay or is he just French? You know,
stylish.
I know they're so stylish, and I love their scarves. Like the men don't wear scarves so much in the U.S. or Canada. But they do, and they're so fantastic.
I learned the power of the scarf when I lived in Paris, so I totally get it.
Yeah, and what was it, Nelly or
foreign? When I was a young gay, and we'd walk around Epcot, we'd be like, see like all these cute dads walk around. We're like, ooh, or is that person like, are they gay or are they just like very fashionable? I don't know.
I know, it's so.
I hate the stereotype, but you know, you can see some trends.
That's really fun. We're going to have to play Nelly or foreign from here on out. You're going to leave a legacy.
That's fine. That's fine. Just be respectful when you do it.
I'm always respectful. When I play all in. So tell me a little bit about, this is actually sort of a great segue into like, what does it mean to be sort of like jokes? Where do you play with jokes? Like, how do you play with, how do you play with the edges and still be EDI friendly, or, what's fair game for a leader? And I'm not talking necessarily about queer leaders, but all leaders. Like, what's fair game? How do you play?
It's a fantastic question, Melody. And I think when I work with leaders, and I never want people to turn off their humor. Of course not. Then we're going against that whole authenticity thing. Mm-hmm. But it's also looking at the context of the group you're with. And I also think too, whether it's explicit, whether it's the corporate values, whatever, if we're striving to create a feedback-rich culture, people will auto-correct for you. Be like, hey, Steve, that's not cool. Oh my gosh, thank you for sharing that. Side note, I always say like, my brothers and sisters, and years ago, I had a trans friend say, please also include non-binary. I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you for that coaching. And so now I always say brothers and sisters and siblings. Now we're inclusive. And I've actually had people ding me on the title of my book, Pride Leadership: Strategies for the LGBTQ Leader to be the king or queen of their jungle. They're like, that's not non-binary. I'm like, you're right. And so I absolutely address it in the preface on why the title is the title. Why is it a male lion on the cover versus a female lion? Because those are great questions to have. And I think if you're creating that type of team culture, that type of corporate culture, you play until someone says, you know what, no. That's not cool. You also start to educate yourself on maybe what, preemptively could be sensitive. I started creating a program on inclusive language for leaders. And the research I'm finding is phenomenal, and things that I didn't even know living in this space for 30 years that really I need to second guess and rethink how I'm using some of those phrasing and then some of that ideology and some of those semantic choices.
I think it's really interesting. And I actually had a conversation recently with a whole bunch of queer cisgendered women who were like, oh my gosh, there's so many terms, there's so many this. And my perspective is literally, if you tell me on Monday you want this name or these pronouns and you change your mind by Wednesday, you just let me know and I'll go with you. Like whoever you want to be, I am your girl. Like I will go with you. I will tell my children. You don't have to make it safe for my children. My children have so much skill around this. Like we literally had a kid who was changing name and gender come to our house on Friday. And then they came back on Sunday with other friends, but they weren't coming out yet. And I was like, hey, we got to go back to the old name and okay, just keep us in the loop.
Safety. Absolutely. And I think that's where, with the leaders I work with, and I work with a lot of cisgendered folks or straight folks, or a lot of times it's white cisgender male folks who are just like, I'm just scared to do anything. I'm like, you know what? If you come at it from a heart-centric leadership perspective, and you just throw it out there and say, look, I want to do my best. I'm going to mess up. You're going to respectfully correct me, and we'll figure this out together. Boom, you're good to go.
Well, and I think that like things like changing pronouns, like the more you love somebody, the harder it is. Like I've got one in my life right now that I'm not knocking out of the park. Like I've like got so much programming in my body that I'm trying to come out of, and I get it wrong. And it's just horrible. Like for me, for them, for the whole thing. But I do think that, with kindness and, forgiveness, and also just not making a big deal of it. Like I love to think about like the oops and the, like oops, and like say something and then move on. Like don't make it a big deal. Like don't draw attention to things in public.
And I equate it to the same idea. Like, I mean, I prefer, unless you're my mother and you're mad at me, I'm not Steven. And very rarely am I Steven. I'm Steve. So when someone calls me Steven, I just politely correct them. No, actually, I prefer Steve. And we move on. And it's kind of the same way with pronouns is how I think about it. Like people are going to mess up, and that's okay. Now, if they're purposely misgendering you or mispronouncing your name, then we can start to play around with that. That's a completely different story. That's lack of respect. And when that's happening. This is where, that whole empathy thing that we talk about in Pride Leadership and all leaders should be talking about. Your gut is awesome. And when it's not right. When someone's doing it to not be inclusive. And so that's a whole different conversation about courage and effective communication. We pull those two together.
Well, and the word fierce comes to mind. Like when should we be fierce as leaders around LGBTQ topics?
I think a leader has to make a priority on creating space for all of the others on their team, or frankly, you will fail. And I think so. One of the things that we teach at TopDog Learning Group, my business, is the focus on being a consciously inclusive leader, and that's our thing. Like we used to have years ago, diversity and inclusion was a separate module within our leadership curriculum. Now it's a running thread, because it has to be. And if you're a smart business, you're also making it a running thread. It's not just this department that celebrates blank month. No, it's part of your strategy to be more consciously inclusive. How are you including your employees? How are you including your customers and those you service? It should not, the D&I function shouldn't be sitting buried in the HR area. It should be sitting next to that CFO suite as part of the business and workplace strategy to be more effective and really just bring success, but also make the world even more inclusive than it already is.
Yeah, and I think that I think you're really right about that. Like HR's had such an interesting place, and then when you start to look at ED&I in different ways, I think, and I do think it can't be like a hammer. Like it's got to be an invitation, a skilling up. I always like when people skill up around these topics. I always feel like I'm personally a safe space. People always say these things. I never know what they're going to ask me, but they're like, I don't know if I can ask you. I've never, and they're like all over the place. And I'm like, spit it out. What do you want to know? And then they've got some question about something, because my kids are in competitive swimming. All this trans swimmers, like a really big deal.
It's amazing how many medical experts, especially gender medical experts, have popped up over the last several weeks. It's incredible.
Well, and I've had some interesting conversations. Like, I love this question of fair. We might as well just talk about it for a second. Oh, it's not fair. It's interesting how that's not relevant for trans people in any other conversation. Like, it's not fair. It's only if it's cisgendered people might not get the fair end of the stick.
Oh, yeah.
And I finally realized my perspective on it is I don't care if every record's held by a trans woman in women's sports. They're women. It's okay. Like, there's no, it's okay. They're women. We're good. Well, question.
And I think the social media conversations I've been having with, and face-to-face conversations with people, when you boil it down to, trans women are women, period. So if you're having an issue, then let's unpack that differently, because no one's talking about the trans boxer Patricio Manuel, who's just rocking and rolling in the boxing world. No one seems to care about this trans man who's winning all these titles and stuff. It's the trans women that they're having issues.
We never talk about the trans men, especially in swimming, who never win another race when they train. We're not trying to make it fair for them. There is nobody trying to make it fair for trans men in sport.
And I think to pull it back from what we as leaders can learn from this is, how are we creating that space for all of the others to be competitive, to be fair, to get those great tasks that we're delegating, or those opportunities to advance within the organization in the workplace, and now we're talking about that unconscious bias. Is that popping up, or that overt bias? Is that popping up within the opportunities we're giving to those around us as a leader?
Yeah. And I also think I've heard this word, the glass cliff for women in leadership. Like, they're having a lot of problems in an organization, and then they bring in a woman and it doesn't go so well because all the problems were there before she started.
Right.
And I'm noticing, like, there's a real opportunity to add trans identities into the leadership conversation at that level. So you don't have a binary conversation. So whatever the challenges are, maybe you want to consider promoting a trans candidate, because it just adds more option. And, but you may not have those candidates if you don't have them if you don't have trans people in your organization.
Right.
What else should we talk about? Like, what are you up to as a leader in your work, and what are you experimenting with right now?
One of the things that I've really taken an interest in given the context of both the pandemic as well as what's happening now within our collective workplaces, and now we're moving to more of these hybrid things, if that's kind of your world, and the concept of proximity bias and how that plays out from a leadership perspective. If you're not familiar with that term, we humans are programmed programmed to like things that are physically close to us. So we favor that person that's sitting next to us in the meeting room versus the person that's on the teleconference or even on the Zoom. And we're just wired that way. And so how's that going to play out from a leadership perspective as the hybrid workplace becomes more of the norm? And what do we as leaders need to do to make sure that we don't fall prey to that proximity bias when we're delegating tasks or even just building relationships with those around us? And it takes effort. We saw that during the pandemic. How am I fostering relationships with my whole team that's virtual? Now we have some people who are next to us. Maybe now we're doing this work environment where I'm only in so many days a week. And so we're not all together, unless it happens or we plan it in one day or another. And what does that look like from a leadership perspective? And what can we do to have some of those best practices so we know that we're not going to fall prey to that proximity bias we have?
I love that. I think that's really interesting. The same is true after spending half my time in the last year in New Mexico and half the time in Canada. We also have this, our ethnocentrism is the same. We've been really grappling with sport. Like people are like, yeah, but this is the most important race in Canada. This is the most important race in the US. Yeah. And we're like, yeah, but we have to see it as a whole. And it really draws attention to that idea in businesses when we have a Canadian division or we have a, division in Paraguay. Like, how do we think about them? Are they an afterthought or are they primary? Like, can we keep them primary? I think that's really interesting.
And I didn't realize until I started reflecting on it quite a bit, and I wrote an article about it, but I first understood the concept of proximity bias when I worked for a cruise line. I worked for Disney Cruise Line years ago. It's my Disney experience. And I was an internal leadership consultant. So I would go on board at the time we had 2 ships, and I do leadership training and coaching and stuff, and I come back in shoreside and do stuff there. And we'd always have this weekly HR meeting between shoreside HR and the shipboard HR teams. And it was a conference call. Now this technology is a little bit older. So at the time we were working over satellites, and the satellites were horribly delayed. And so you already started disenfranchising whoever was on the call, depending on your perspective, because the delay was there. So not only do you have proximity bias that they're not next to you, but now you had like this weird delay in communication. And so I remember when we first started these conversations, and I noticed when we were sitting in the HR space in shoreside in Florida, there'd be people who would ignore the folks on the phone. So I finally had the idea, like, let's take pictures of everybody who's on the ships, and when they're on the call, we had them on little sticks that stand up, and we just have their little faces by the conference call. The teleconference machine. And so, so we could physically remember, that's right, so-and-so's on, Ruth Ann's on, or whatever. So there was that step, and that helped a little bit. But then I noticed when I'd be on board the ships and we'd have the same meetings, but now I'm sitting on the other side, they had the exact same experience where they were disenfranchising the folks who weren't in the room. And so, and I thought about that and some of the ways we started to think about it, and then flash forward to now, technology is different, but the situation's still the same. And I really think it's going to be one of those opportunities that's going to make or break different teams, especially those hybrid teams out there.
Well, and I think it's so interesting because when you have a Zoom team, like when you have a team on Zoom, there is a great equalizer. If everyone is on Zoom, that everybody's picture is the same size. Everybody takes up about the same amount of space. So as a team coach, I love doing Zoom sometimes for team coaching because it's that, like, it frames it in a weird equality, and it disrupts some of the patterns an in-person team might have.
The only challenge and I totally agree with you, Melanie. The only challenge I have is when some team members don't really know how to think about putting their best Zoom foot forward. It's one of the things we talk about, like, the camera angle is going up their nose, or they're sitting in front of a window, so all you see this gorgeous silhouette, and it's not that you're staging a show, but you're staging a show because everybody's getting data from what's either behind me in my physical space or my virtual, and we're all making, those are signals that we're sending and making into perceptions, and we want to make sure that we're sending the right perceptions to those who are receiving the message.
Well, and I have a question for you. I've been seeing this phenomenon, and I'm not going to present this like perfectly because, sometimes my brain just goes to these places and I work on it in my head, and I've been kind of chewing on this, but you do enough ED&I work that I'm really curious about it. So I work in tech a lot, and I've noticed that there's these people in tech who are prizes, like women, you know, Black women, for example. They're like a prize in leadership. But because they're a prize, like because they don't have enough women in tech and they don't have enough people of color in tech, and so then they become this sort of prize. But because of that, because they're so valuable in the economy of ED&I, they don't get any feedback about their leadership. And so it's really hard for them to grow.
Yeah.
And I keep seeing this exact same thing, that like they get a lot more latitude in their decision making, so they can hang themselves way better, like on bad leadership decision making. But then nobody says anything, so they don't get any like of the same feedback loops or 360 data. I don't know. Have you seen this phenomenon?
I have not experienced that phenomenon with the folks that I work with and the coaching situations that I'm in, but I could imagine that if there's kind of a lack of trust within the overall workplace, coupled with a discomfort with providing balanced feedback to all those involved, I could see that kind of bubbling up as a at Disney, we never said a problem. We said an area of opportunity. So I could see that as being an area of opportunity for overall leadership to kind of grapple with it and to make sure that, you know, we're not doing a bias on the other side, which is that kind of favoritism mentality.
Well, it just I've seen it a couple of times recently, and I'm curious about who we need to be brave as we up our diversity to actually develop leaders who are diverse, who may not come from a background where they got a lot of development in their early leadership life. And so I think it's something to pay attention to.
Yeah, I agree.
And to be kind and supportive of, like, not giving feedback to someone because of their diversity it's not a kindness.
Well, when I talk about you know, how you foster an inclusive work culture, you know, there's zero silver bullets. It's not like, you know, Steve, come in and do a keynote, yay, we're inclusive. No, that could be one of many arrows in your quiver. But the one thing that really starts with, I truly am passionate about creating a feedback-rich culture where feedback is seen as a gift and as a positive thing. You know, when I do a lot of like my leadership stuff, I always ask people, you know, when someone comes up to you and says, "Oh, I have some feedback for you," what's your emotional reaction? Like right in that moment. Because chances are people are like, "Ooh, feedback, give it to me." Because they've been trained, Pavlov's dog, that the word feedback is bad. Well, it's not. I mean, if you're doing it right, feedback is this gorgeous gift to make me an even better leader, just like the point you were just saying. And so
information, you're missing the information you need to grow.
Things that you're missing because you can't see it. And someone's saying, look, I'm going to have the bravery and the courage to share with you what I see. Now, also along that same line, you know, feedback is a gift, just like that gift you get from that crazy aunt, whoever, who always gives you that ugly holiday sweater. And what do you do when you get that gift? Thank you very much. I truly appreciate you making the effort. You don't necessarily have to believe the feedback, but know it's a gift and at least take it with some honor and try to see, you know, how they got to that perspective. You may not agree with it, but find out how they got there.
And where can people find you, Steve?
The easiest way is if you go to topdoglearning.biz, you'll get redirected to our master page. But there you can find all about the stuff that we do at TopDog Learning Group. You'll see both Pride Leadership and some of my other books. You'll see Meet My Team. We have some free learning tapas, which is what we call little bite-sized learning vignettes, and some other cool stuff and ways to get a hold of us.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for being on the show. We'll make sure you get that link in the show notes as well. And thank you for coming. I really enjoyed having you here.
Thank you so much for this.
It was just great talking to Dr. Steve today. I love this idea of feedback being a gift. I think it is the deepest gift to be having access to information. I think so often as leaders, we're afraid of information if it doesn't align with what we already believe. And so I really encourage you, as you get information, to see it as information, to be curious about what you knew already, what you didn't know, and not to leap to an immediate defense of yourself, like that you didn't know was because of this or that, but just to go, oh, that's really interesting. Let me think about that. And then buy yourself time. Anytime you're getting feedback that's hard to take, just give yourself a minute. Just say, hey, let me think about that for a little while and get back to you. It's always okay to ask more time. It's great for anytime you meet with a manager and they say something to you that you aren't like in the moment, just train yourself to ask for more time. Like, wow, that's really interesting. Let me think about that for a minute and get back to you. It's a great leadership skill. It has been great being with you here today. Go experiment.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Experimental Leader. We hope you have found value in today's episode because we're dedicated to helping you become the experimental leader you want to be. To access the show notes or learn more about working with Melanie, visit melanieparish.com. Go experiment.